I just want to start by revisiting an article you wrote for Catalyst a few years ago called Democracy's Morbid Symptoms. In your article, I feel like you kind of look at a couple different perspectives on democracy that sort of consolidated under the Trump era, right? So, when Trump was president, there was obviously a lot of concern that he was violating democratic norms, that, American democracy was like steps from, complete collapse. And you wrote your article before the 2020 election and obviously before the Capitol riot. But as we all know, after the 2020 election, Trump tried to overturn the results and then, of course, encouraged his rally goers to storm the Capitol. So this is all to say that there is clearly like ample cause for concern when it comes to Trump's relationship to democracy. But I think something that's really interesting about your piece in Catalyst is you point out that very often liberal commentators will kind of conceive of threats to democracy as really just like attacks on civility or attacks on political norms, or even attacks on elite institutions, right? And you argue that this is actually like not the most productive way to think about democracy. So just by way of opening, I wanted to ask you, like, what is a better way of understanding the ongoing so-called crisis of democracy? And has anything really changed since the Trump era?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me here on the show. Happy to be here and to see you too and talk to you a little bit about all this. It's a great question. Yeah, I think what I was trying to get at in that piece, among other things, was this line of argumentation, or kind of this this theme, this recurrent theme that emerged, under the Trump administration, which was very common in kind of mainstream publications, many of which are aimed at, fairly well-educated and liberal audiences, in which, the threat that Trump and the Republican Party posed, to democracy, in general, or to American institutions and things like that, had to do with, Trump's assault and the Republican Party's assault on, the norms. We heard about this all the time. These norms had to do in many cases, in the view of a lot of these commentators, with, the civility and bipartisanship that, in their view used to exist in American politics, and, is sort of the background condition, or kind of like the underlying sort of cultural condition that, allows democracy, in their view, to proceed. And to prevent it from kind of getting out of hand and producing these sorts of intractable conflicts that seem to have really set in here in the U.S. over the last few years, and which are not amenable to any kind of collaboration or cooperation or compromise. In this kind of telling, it's those sorts of norms around civility and bipartisanship and compromise, that are, cast as the sort of essential condition, of democracy, rather than, competition, rather than conflict, rather than, real kind of, conflict over, different conceptions of the good society and what it should be. That was one of the motivating factors behind writing this piece, and for taking up that that kind of question, because, in my view, and I think, we would all agree, the Trump administration, the Republican Party in general, the broader right wing in the United States really does pose some real threats to democracy, such as it is in the United States. And they should be combated and confronted at every single turn. But if we're looking at, norm erosion, or, attacks on or breaches of civility and so on as the threat, rather than, attacks on the right to vote, rather than attacks on the right of working people to organize, rather than the kind of fundamentally anti-majoritarian, and in a lot of respects, anti-democratic nature of the American political system itself. If we're not looking at those things, and instead we're looking at things like civility and norms and what have you, which I don't want to entirely, kind of dismiss as unimportant, but, which I think are symptoms here rather than causes. If we're not looking at those really, I think primary underlying factors and causes behind, the real erosion, I think, of democratic politics, not just in the U.S., but in a lot of other countries as well, then, I think we're missing the point here. And the sorts of political interventions that we would therefore try to make won't be as effective as they might be otherwise.
So I just want to quickly follow up on that by asking about Biden, right? Because he's in office now, Trump's gone, so we have the restoration of all of the norms, and we also have Democratic administration that is pretty vocal about, opposing some of the right's attempts to like gerrymander or, institute new voting rights, or sorry, institute new voting restrictions. Sorry. But I guess the question for you is like, given what I have identified as the sort of more fundamental assaults on democracy, how much has really changed since Biden took office?
Well, we haven't seen too much in the way of, I think, real substantive change on this front for a whole host of reasons. I do think it's worth kind of underscoring and staying with, for a moment, the various things that the Republicans have tried to do, not just in Congress, but also just as importantly, at the state level, here in the country, since last fall's election. I just saw a tweet earlier today by Bernie Sanders, where he says something like 33 states around the country have passed laws over the last, year or so, making it harder to cast votes than it was before in the state. Considering the barriers to voting and the relatively low levels of political participation in the country, during so-called normal times, that's quite bad. In addition to those sorts of barriers, to voting that I think probably most of our viewers are pretty familiar with, they've also been taking advantage of their political advantage in many states around the country to really drive this current round of redistricting that happens once every 10 years in relationship with the census. So, there's all kinds of moves at the state level in states where Republicans tend to dominate, to draw maps that are, extremely favorable to the Republican Party and to its incumbents, so that it becomes extremely difficult, if not totally impossible, to vote them out of a majority, even if, the Democrats, which is going to be the main opposition party to them, even if they win majorities of the vote for, their delegations to Congress or to their delegations to the state legislature. We see this happening in states like Texas, Georgia, just all over the map. And it's very concerning. I think that, democratic socialists, people on the left, should be very alarmed about these various attempts to, undermine even the very limited and contested forms of democracy that we have in the United States, and to do what we can to combat them. Biden and the Democratic Party as a whole, its leaders in Congress have, I think, talked actually a fairly good game about what the Republican Party is trying to do and has done in the places where it dominates politically. Unfortunately, that has not translated yet into much in the way of a substantive response. There have been 2 attempts to pass voting rights bills in Congress so far this year, and they've both been defeated. And they've both been defeated because of the Senate filibuster, first and foremost. I think the most recent attempt to pass a voting rights bill in the Senate got the support of all 50 Democrats and 1 Republican, Lisa Murkowski from Alaska. But so long as the filibuster rule exists, that's not enough. You're going to need to get to 60 votes. So, I think it's put up or shut up time, for Democrats in Washington and in Congress. And in the White House, if we're going to go around saying that, what the Republican Party is trying to do, is a fundamental existential threat to democracy in the United States, then the response has to be commensurate to that threat. Things like the Senate filibuster, which is a norm, need to be confronted and dismantled, taken apart, abolished, so that legislation that has majority support, not just in the population at large, but also in Congress as well, can actually get passed. So that these bills wouldn't necessarily completely transform the nature of elections or of the basic structure and system of representation in the United States, but would push back, I think, fairly meaningfully against some of the worst Republican attacks on voting rights and similar things in the states. Would do things like restore some of the basic, very basic protections that the Supreme Court gutted from the Civil Rights Act a few years ago and the Voting Rights Act a few years ago, and would do something minimally meaningful to address these threats to democracy. To date, they haven't really followed through on that in a substantive and practical way, and I hope we see that kind of action take place. And it's up to people like us, I think, to keep pushing, to keep organizing, and to keep fighting, so that the rhetoric that we see coming out of the Biden administration, that we see coming out of official Washington among the leaders of the Democratic Party, turns into some real action and some real meaningful reform of things like the archaic Senate rules of the filibuster and so forth, so that something could actually be done to combat what the Republicans are trying to do at the state level, which is really quite alarming and should be fought.
Mm-hmm. And one particularly undemocratic feature of the U.S. state you write a lot about is federalism. So I think kind of give us a refresher civics lesson. I mean, what is federalism, and how does this play out in terms of how to our state is actually organized and functions?
Sure. Yeah, good question. So, what federalism refers to is essentially the kind of the fragmentation or the kind of the decentralization of political authority in the United States. This operates kind of in two directions. One direction is vertically, and another direction is horizontally. So, vertically speaking, that means we've got the federal government, we've got the state governments, and we've got the various local governments underneath those state governments. And then horizontally, that refers to all the various relationships between the states. So basically what that means practically is like there's, unlike in some other countries where there's more of a centralized and unitary form of government, we have more of a decentralized and fragmented form of government. And that's, I think, very important for a whole host of reasons. And one of them means that one of the ramifications of that means that, we can see some real inequality in this country in terms of, the level of social services that are provided, the general quality of government that is provided, the level of democratic participation that is available to people in this country, based on basically the accident of where they happen to live. And, for me, and I think for probably most of the viewers of the show, that violates some very kind of basic, democratic principles. I don't think that the level of political participation that's available to you should depend on what state you happen to live in, or whether you have access to something like Medicaid should be dependent on what state you live in. That kind of basic system of federalism that we have in this country, which kind of decentralizes and fragments power and political authority, can lead to these very, in my view, undemocratic, infringements on people's basic rights and freedoms based on, who happens to dominate politically in, say, whatever state or locality someone happens to live in.
It does seem like, champions of federalism will often kind of try to make the case that federalism is good for democracy, or it's like expanding democracy in a way, right? Like if you don't like what the federal government is doing, your state, you can vote for laws in your state that can like overturn or ignore those laws. Or, within a city or a municipality, you can do the same thing, right? So I'm from Idaho, so like unfortunately, the first thing that came to my mind is Second Amendment sanctuary cities, which is like a thing that's happening in Idaho, where you'll have cities and counties that are like, we refuse to recognize the federal government's like gun laws, and we're not going to enforce them here. But to take like a more progressive example or whatever, like you can also see that we're not going to be able to pass Medicare for all in the US without obviously a very hard and long protracted fight because of institutions like the Senate. But is there a chance that it could happen on the state level? Unclear, So I guess the question is sort of like, is there a way in which federalism can work to our advantage, or is that view misguided?
Great question. Yeah, I mean, this idea of the states being, so-called laboratories of democracy is an idea that comes, out of the progressive period in the early part of the 20th century, when, progressive reformers of various types, tried to use state government in order to sort of test out or pioneer, new forms of social policy that, theoretically then could spread to other states based on their example. I think in a country as big and as varied and diverse as the United States is, I do think that there's something to be said for some level, meaningful level of political and administrative decentralization. Unfortunately, however, I think the particular mode of kind of decentralization or a federalism that we've seen in the United States has operated, mostly to protect and advance the interests of people who already have power, and to make it extremely difficult in various ways for poor people, working class people, African Americans, and other people that have been on the short end of the stick throughout American history. Has made it really difficult for those people to organize, to advance and defend their own interests. What's particularly interesting and I think ironic and frustrating to me about the way that federalism is practiced here in the United States is that it often doesn't actually, in practice, allow for a greater degree of local experimentation, local democracy, and things like that, because of the central role that the states play in the form of federalism that we have in the United States. Just over the last few years, we've seen in a number of cities where the left and I guess progressives in general, where kind of the center left and the left is relatively strong, where activists, organizers, organizations have tried to pass fairly progressive legislation at the local level around things like minimum wages or environmental policy or LGBTQ policy, only to see these laws preempted by reactionary governments at the state level. Because here in the US, our form of federalism really centers the state. It's a state-based kind of federalism. In our case law and our constitutional sort of theory and history, the locality, the municipality, is seen as a creature of the state, rather than kind of its own independent entity with its own sort of sources of authority. So what winds up happening is it just so happens that cities, kind of more urban and metropolitan areas, traditionally have been the places, at least in the 20th century, where and into the 21st century, where the left, broadly speaking, has been strongest. Where theoretically, at least, it would be the easiest for it to win political power and see through, something of a progressive legislative agenda locally. But when it has tried to do that, if the state happens to be dominated by either Republicans or corporate and establishment Democrats, those localities can sometimes run into either delays in implementation of laws, or just an outright repeal or preemption of progressive legislation in the case of progressive municipalities trying to do things that a reactionary state government just says, no, sorry, you can't do that. If you try to do that, we're going to harm you in XYZ ways. Another instance where we've seen that happen recently over the past year or two is when local Local municipalities try to do things like, require mask wearing in schools and things like that. But, then the state government turns around and says, hey, if you go ahead and try to do that, we're going to take away your funding, or we're going to do other things to make your life miserable. We've seen that happen in Florida, for instance, over the last year or so. So yeah, it's a system of federalism that, in the telling of its defenders, is supposed to allow for, diversity, freedom, experimentation, the states as laboratories of democracy and things like that. But, more often than not, in practice, the states have been these engines of inequality. In many cases, they've also been, kind of they've also crushed, attempts to, experiment politically and with policy at the most local level, at the municipal level. I think the track record here for American-style federalism is great. It doesn't, I think, live up to the lofty promises that its defenders have made for it over time. It also tends to, in practice, snuff out actual attempts at experimenting with, with democracy and with public policy at the local level.
If you like this video from The Jacobin Show, please hit like and subscribe and share with your friends. Thanks.